We're going to work on another seashell today. I'm not actually sure what these are called. They may be called conchs or conch or cowries, perhaps. They all start out with a pointy top with this kind of spiraling ridges, and then they have a bigger section that's sometimes more textured and sometimes less textured. And so we're going to create an unrealistic version of one of these types of shells. And you can ultimately decide what shape you want for your shell yourself. But I'm basically, as usual, not tracing anything out. And I cut a vaguely tear-shaped piece of cloth that I'm going to use as my base, and I'm going to stitch on top of it. And I like to start with a piece of cloth often because that allows me to just focus on my stitches and not worrying about covering up all the space. So I'm starting from the tip end of my shell, and I'm creating the pattern and securing this cloth down at the same time. If you're more comfortable either pinning or basting your cloth on before you start doing the decorative stitches, you can certainly do that, but I just head right into the stitches. So I started out with a small fly stitch right up at the top, and then as my shell gets wider, I'm going to do a variation on a fly stitch. This is actually sometimes called an open chain stitch. So the spokes of my stitch are spread out to either side of my shell, and then with a fly stitch there's just one securing stitch below it. But what I'm doing is I'm using two securing stitches that allow my thread to curve rather than go straight across. And that creates a nice way to recreate the ridges that you see in the shell there. And how many am I going to do? 3 or 4. It depends on what I feel like. Now, if your shape gets quite wide, then you might want to do 3 securing stitches, but I think for the size of my shell that 2 is probably enough on either side. So this is kind of a funny stitch. You can call it an open chain stitch, but it's also similar to couching in many ways. So couching, to do that stitch, you would lay down one long piece of thread, and then you would take a series of securing stitches wherever you wanted it to go. When I did that jellyfish, I used that couching stitch to create the tendrils. So when I decided that I felt like I had enough of these ridges, I still have some thread left, so I'm going to go around the outside edge of my shell here with a blanket stitch, which secures the raw edge around the outside edge. It also adds a little bit of definition, so it allows the shell to show up. And some of these shells have a very ruffled side. I'll do more of this stitch to give it a very ruffled side on one side. And sometimes you can see shadow lines from the inside part of the shell. So I'm going to go all the way around using blanket stitch to secure my shell down. And in hindsight, it may have made sense to actually have started out with the blanket stitch so that the shell was held in place before I started doing those decorative stitches, but it doesn't matter. These little bits of cloth are small enough that I find it easy enough just to hold on to them while I do whatever stitches, and once I've got a few stitches in place, they just hold on. And look at that. I had just the right amount of thread to finish off that shape. And now I could decide that I'm done. That's a perfectly good shape, and I could stop right there. Or I could start embellishing the shape. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a bit of a ruffle on on one of the outside edges, because some of these shells are quite frilly. And now what I realized is to create a frilly look, so I'm using more of the blanket stitch. And to create a frilly look, I want to do very uneven blanket stitches. Some of them are a bit closer together, some of them are a little bit further apart, some of them are longer than others. And that variation creates a very frilly look. Now, I noticed that for some reason I've got a pen mark on my finger, it's meaningless. I don't know why it's there. So don't ignore the pen mark. I know some people will put marks on their finger with a Sharpie to allow them to keep their stitches even. That's not what I'm doing here. I don't even know why it's there. So that's created a nice frilly look, and you're thinking, but those frills are kind of transparent. Well, they are. So I can go in and start filling them in a little bit, either with chain stitch would be nice, or just with some straight stitches. And I can do this with different colors. So just like with some of the other objects I've done in the past, I've used a variety of colors of thread for the decorative stitches. I'm going to do that for this piece as well. But since I've got some of this brown thread left, I'm filling them in with a bit with the brown thread. And then later on, once I've changed the color of my thread, I'll add some more stitching into this ruffle with different colors, and it will create a lot of variety and variation and be kind of interesting. Now, in hindsight, again, maybe dark brown is not the best shade to use here. It probably would have made sense if I'd chosen a base color that was more similar to the body of the shell. But really, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. These are just very imaginative shapes. They're not meant to mimic reality at all. They're just for fun. So as long as my shape is recognizable as a shell, which I think it is, a seashell, which I think it is, then I'm going to call this a success. And if it's not recognizable as a seashell, well, my strategy is to add more. As a maximalist, I add more. So after I finish creating this ruffle here, I could decide that I'm done, or I could add more. So now you can stop there and decide you're finished here. Or if you want, you can add more things. So I've changed the color of my thread, and I'm using thread that's been left over from another project here, which is how I've chosen the color. But you could be more intentional with the colors that you pick. And these shapes are going to be more like textured ridges, lumps and bumps on my shell. So I don't necessarily want them to look like spots. I just want them to be subtly textured there. So it's not a bad choice for a color. It's just a little bit odd, but that's kind of the fun of it. See what happens. So what I'm doing is I'm creating a row of French knots. They're spaced apart and they're somewhat irregular, but they are following that curved line across the shell, because I don't necessarily want these things to be random. The shell, what I've noticed is that the lines and things that you see on the shell, they follow the contours of the shell. So that's what I'm kind of doing with the French knots. I'm roughly and imperfectly following the contours. I don't want it to be such a stiff line that it looks plastic. I want it to have some natural variations, but still have some conformity as well. So I will do as many rows of French knots as my thread length, my short thread length, because I think I mentioned that in the last video. I recently purchased a secondhand tray full of embroidery threads that had already been cut into shortish lengths, so it's limiting how much of any color I can use, which actually is a benefit here because it forces me to change threads, and then I have a good excuse to change colors often. And once I feel like I've got enough French knots, I'm just going to do some straight stitches, which again follow the contours. They're not random. The straight stitches are going to be going vertically up and down, so it's creating some of the lines that you see in some of those shells are vertical rather than horizontal. So I'm creating those sorts of shapes. So before I run out of thread completely, I'm going to go in and fill in some of the ruffle here as well to add a little bit more variety there in the color. There and there, I can once again decide that now I'm done here and stop here. But I'm going to add more. So I've changed the color of my thread again, And I'm going to add some more French knots in a different color, which adds to the variety and the texture and visual interest to the shell. Now, my daughter pointed this out to me one time, and it had to do with my Halloween costume. This is my very wise daughter. She said, "Mom, you don't need to add any more. It's like nail polish." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And she said, "If you've got one layer of nail polish and you add a second net layer to it, it looks a lot better. But if you've already got 5 layers of nail polish on there, adding a 6th layer is not going to make a difference." And I think that it's true of the stitching as well. So, you know, 1 layer of stitching here looks pretty good. And if you add a second layer, it looks even better. But at some point, you've got enough going on there that you don't have to add any more. No one's going to notice. And when do you reach that point? It's really up to you to decide. And if you don't like doing French knots, don't do them. So now you can stop here, but I'm not going to. I'm going to keep going. Now I'm adding some horizontal lines, just some straight stitches or back stitches across those ridges to, again, add more texture and variety. Are they necessary? Is this the point where I've got my 5 layers and that's enough? I don't know. But I've got these threads and they're fairly short and they're left over from other things. So, hey, why not use them up? This is a good way to use up your little bits of threads. Are these called orts? Is that what stitchers call them? I know weavers call the short leftover lengths thrums. So now you can stop there. Am I going to stop here? It looks like I'm done. So anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and I will see you again soon. Bye for now.